So welcome. I'm so glad you all could be here. I'm Beth, she, her pronouns from Book Group Services here at Mid-Continent Public Library, and I will be the staff facilitator. Some best practices for this program are we do just ask that you stay muted during the presentation. Feel free to put questions in the chat. I will be monitoring, and this will be recorded for archival purposes. For those of you who have checked out physical copies from the Booktalk collection, I will be monitoring and refresh your due dates here shortly. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email booktalk@mymcpl.org if you have any questions. So I would love to introduce Doug Richardson of the National Park Service. Doug is about to start his 30th year with the National Park Service and has served at 8 national parks in 4 states. Almost 34 years ago, he decided to study history and history education in college, inspired by the writing of David McCullough. He has been at the Truman home since January 2017 and started developing programs with Mid-Continent weeks after his arrival. Truman was always his dream park, in part because of the book we are discussing today. He and his wife are staunch believers in the public library system, and yes, his wife made him say that last line. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Beth. And yes, my wife is sitting in a room next to me here, so I wanted to make sure that we got that in. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are new to this group, welcome. You are most welcome, and I'm thrilled that you are here. If you are returning, thank you for sticking with this. I hope that you are finding this as enjoyable as it is for me to assemble and put this together and present to you. My name is Doug Richardson. I'm the Chief Ranger at the Truman home. And this particular program series, the guided tour of Truman, is something that from the very beginning in my career, something that I've always wanted to do. As wonderful as Mr. McCullough's narrative history is, I very much enjoy the source notes at the end of the book because he can point you in so many different directions. So what I want to do with this program series is to share with you some of the items that Mr. McCullough used to assemble this book all those years ago, and then also share some things from our park museum collection that aren't necessarily seen by a lot of people. And what we do at the Truman home is we take care of these wonderful historic buildings and all of these artifacts and archival pieces on behalf of the American people. That's through the generosity of Bess Wallace Truman, who left us her family's home and the contents to the American people, and credit to the people. And thank you for allowing us to do what we do. So how about we take off and let's start exploring our episode number 3. This is a partnership between us, the National Park Service, and Mid-Continent Public Library. I'm speaking to you today from the almost brand new Green Hills Library Center, which if you haven't been in the Green Hills branch, it is marvelous. Also part of this particular branch is a wonderful culinary arts center. So if you love the culinary arts or think you might like to try culinary arts, check out the Culinary Arts Center because there are some really fantastic, really wonderful things coming up. So for this particular series, we're going to start sort of where we left off last time. In the spring of 1919, Captain Harry S. Truman and his men with Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery, 35th Division of the United States Army, returned home from serving nobly in World War I. As is the case with many veterans, Mr. Truman was probably wondering, what now? What now? He had a couple of options. He had the option of going back to the family farm in Grandview. He had the option of continuing in a business partnership that he had with some friends and colleagues, the Morgan and Company Oil. or he could try something different. But one thing that was definite that Harry Truman was going to do was that he was going to marry the great love of his life, Miss Bess Wallace of Independence. They had met back in 1890 when Harry Truman was 6, Miss Wallace was 5. So Harry Truman fell in love with Bess Wallace at a very young age, never fell out of love with her. It wasn't necessarily a courtship from the beginning. The courtship itself didn't start until 1910, but thanks to perseverance, some wonderful letter writing, a very powerful love campaign, we'll call it, on June 28th, 1919, Harry Truman finally got the girl. And so at 4 o'clock on that afternoon, Miss Wallace, Mr. Truman were married at Trinity Episcopal Church, which still stands in Independence today. It's part of the Harry S. Truman Historic District, National Historic Landmark. And one person remembered that you never saw a more anxious groom in your life than you did with Harry Truman, that he said, "I do," many times, and that's understandable because he had waited about 29 years to be able to say those two magical words. I wanted to share with you two relatively famous but always wonderful photographs from the wedding day. The one that you'll see on the left is the wedding portrait of Harry Truman and now Bess Wallace Truman. And then on the right, you will see the wedding party. Now, both of those photographs were taken in the yard of 219 North Delaware Street, the now Mrs. Truman's home. We often wonder where specifically in the yard those photographs were taken. I can only share with you my hunch. My hunch is that these photographs were taken near the center of the north side of the yard, right by where Truman Road is today. That's where I think this photograph was taken. But what you see there in these photographs are two people who very much were committed to each other. And indeed, after this day, they had 53 wonderful years together. Now, I want to share with you something. You may have seen these photographs somewhere before, but I want to share something with you that perhaps you might not have seen before. And if you haven't, that's okay, because this photograph was not known about until just a few years ago. This is the interior of Trinity Episcopal Church on, I've got a typo there, I'm sorry, it's June 28th, 1919. I'm sorry, I should have caught that. This particular photograph, we wish we knew who took this photograph, but we don't. But it was found in the collection of the papers of Margaret Truman Daniel and her husband, E. Clifton Daniel. Now, how this came to be, now a few years ago in 2019, just a few months before the COVID pandemic hit, we at the Truman home with the Truman Library, the Independence Square Association, the City of Independence, a lot of really wonderful partners gathered together to commemorate the 100th wedding anniversary of President and Mrs. Truman. And we had a wonderful series of events that were well received and attended. One of my great memories is that one of the events was an invitation for people to come and have their wedding vows renewed on the front steps of the Truman Library. We expected only a few couples to do that, but we had over 70 couples come and do that, and that was just absolutely wonderful. But as we were preparing this series of programs, one of the wonderful archivists at the Truman Library, Tammy Williams, very excitedly came into a meeting and shared this photograph. One of the reasons that I love this photograph is it does give a little bit of an indication that one story that's been told in oral histories was probably true, that in one of the very few interviews that President Truman's sister, Mary Jane Truman, gave, she remembered in the frantic effort to get all of their work done on the family farm in Grandview and then to make the trip up here to Independence, that she quickly gathered some flowers to be part of the arrangement on the altar at Trinity. But it was so hot that not long after the arrangements were set up, that the flowers just started to wilt. And I could understand that because I can attest that on June 28th of 2019, real field temperature was about 115 degrees. So I can imagine that it was hot. So there it is, Trinity Episcopal Church, June 28th, 1919. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to be able to show you that. If you're listening or watching, Tammy, thank you for finding this photograph. I'd like to show you something else too, that indeed, when Bess Wallace Truman left her family's home to the American people, she left the contents of it, with a few exceptions that were to go to her daughter, Margaret, understandably. She left the contents to the American people as well. So that includes the books, and that includes furniture. It even includes a car. It also includes textiles. And so one of the things that we have in our museum collection today, preserved on your behalf, is something that fills me with awe every time that I see it. And it is part of the suit that Harry Truman wore the day of his wedding. It's a beautiful suit. The photograph doesn't quite do the coat justice. It's a houndstooth coat with a beautiful check to it. And it's just absolutely wonderful to behold. Now, we at the Truman Home, we are just starting a process to develop, design, and build a new visitor center for our park visitors that will have a small museum exhibit in it. And I'm really hoping that we will be able to include this jacket. This jacket was made for future President Truman by his best man and a good friend of his, Theodore Ted Marks, who was a very gifted tailor, and they would be friends for the rest of their respective lives. But you'll see that the suit was made on 5/17/1919, and I also included the receipt and the invoice for that. So next time you go to Macy's or Men's Warehouse or where have you to have a suit or an outfit made, you can think about this. Mr. Truman paid about $70 probably for the suit. But now what? What will Mr. Truman do? And an important question, where will he live? Again, the option was for him to go back to the family farm in Grandview. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting. Now, in one oral history that we have that was done by a lovely lady by the name of Mary May Wallace, he was married to Bess Wallace Truman's brother, George. May Wallace, late in life, did an oral history interview, one with us, with the National Park Service, did another one for the Truman Library. In her oral history, she gave an indication or a hint that at least for a brief period of time, that the newlyweds lived at the Truman farm. So if Mrs. Wallace is correct, then after Harry and Bess Wallace Truman went on their honeymoon up into Chicago and then Michigan and came home, that they moved out to the farm, if but for a little while. But one thing I found a couple of years ago when I was researching the final years of Bess Truman's mother, Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace, when I was reading her obituaries, and most of these obituaries were sent out by wire services, you know, the Associated Press and United Press International and such. When the wedding of Bess and Harry Truman was mentioned in these obituaries, they used a very curious set of words. They said that one of the conditions of the marriage was that the newlyweds lived at 219 North Delaware Street. Now, those words are very interesting to me. One of the conditions. What are the others? We don't know. We'll probably never know. Now, by this time in 1919, Mother Wallace was getting older. She was in what we would call middle age today. Her mother, Mrs. Elizabeth Emery Gates, was still alive. Now, Mother Wallace was not necessarily in the best of health. I can sympathize with her in that she had back problems, spine problems, sciatic nerve problems. And if any of my friends here today have any problems with your sciatica, you know how painful that can be. But if the new Mr. and Mrs. Truman moved to the farm, it must have been for a relatively short time, because it appears that pretty soon they were living at 219 North Delaware Street, and that would be their home for the rest of Harry and Bess Wallace Truman's lives. That's what they would call home. And it also financially makes sense in that when you put together what we're going to talk about right now, a soldier coming home from war, it makes some sense to live at home, start a professional career, get a few dollars in the bank, and start your life that way. So I think that sort of makes sense as well. Now, one of the things that Bess Wallace wrote to her fiance, Harry Truman, in one of her oldest surviving Dear Harry letters was that Harry Truman's old business partner, Mr. Morgan, had a job waiting for him in the oil business. Now, I wish we knew a little bit more about that, but unfortunately, that's all that we know. But eventually, and it seems like very soon, after Harry Truman and Battery D got home from World War I, he decided to open with his friend Eddie Jacobson a haberdashery in downtown Kansas City. Now, this too made sense because during their months in training, getting ready to serve in World War I in Kansas, Harry Truman and Eddie Jacobson operated a canteen on base there. And if you think of the canteen almost like, if you're from the local area here, almost like a Quick Trip, like a convenience store. And the canteen on base was very successful. It turned a profit, and that profit went back to the soldiers. So they had a successful business on base. So it gave them an indication that they would be able to operate a successful business together. And so they made all the plans. Now, you might have read in Mr. McCullough's book how to raise capital for this investment. Harry Truman and his mother and his sister Mary Jane sold a lot of livestock, sold a lot of equipment that could translate relatively easily into capital. Now, what that essentially meant was that the farm as a business was going out of business. And so the farm in Grandview became more of simply a home and a subsistence property for Mama Truman and for Mary Jane and for others in the family. So Harry Truman, Eddie Jacobson invested. They announced that they were going to open this haberdashery on or about October 1st of 1919. And it was a good time to open a haberdashery in Kansas City. You had a lot of soldiers coming home who needed clothes. And so this men's furnishing store had a wide variety of shirts and collars. A lot of shirts didn't have the attached collars like the ones we have today. So they contracted with a vendor that manufactured IDE products, IDE. And so when you walked into what Harry Truman called the shirt store, you had some high quality products in the store. I wanted to show you today, I drove down a few days ago just to give you a little bit of an idea. In the day, the haberdashery was almost catty corner from the Muehlebach Hotel in downtown Kansas City. Now, eventually the building that the haberdashery was in was torn down. This is what's there today. And it's not far, if you're familiar with where the Muehlebach is, or even where Central Library is for the Kansas City Public Library. It's not very far from there. So when I was taking this photograph for you, I sort of wondered if President Truman was standing right beside me, what he would have to say about what happened there on 12th Street. And I wanted to show you a little bit about the lease. Now, I think the big thing in the lease would be the money. And the lease that they signed for the building stipulated rent at $350 a month. Now, I used an inflation calculator from the United States Department of Commerce, and that translated to $6,100 a month. I am not a businessman. I've never operated a business, so I honestly have no idea what an average rent is for a business space like this. So if any of you do, I'd be very interested in knowing if you think that today in 2023, if you think that $6,100 a month is somewhat reasonable. Is that what the average is for a building of that size? Trying to get my slides to advance here, sorry. I'm not sure why it's not doing that. Okay, there we go. You might have read in Mr. McCullough's book how the men of Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery, they were very grateful to Captain Harry Truman. Now, unfortunately, Harry Truman's particular battery did have some deaths as a result of influenza and some other disease, but Harry Truman did not lose a man in combat during World War I. So he was able to bring his men home, most of them on the Lusitania, the ship, the Lusitania. And one of the things that the men of Battery D did was they purchased for Captain Truman a beautiful, what's called a loving cup. And this loving cup it found a home inside of Truman and Jacobson. And I love how Mr. McCullough described how business went in this particular establishment. Business was very good in its first year. It appears as if they cleared about $70,000 in sales. And so they were able to pay all their bills and make good on their investments. But when 1920 turned into 1921, that's when some problems started to hit. And not only for Mr. Truman and Mr. Jacobson, but in a national recession, depression, a lot of people were starting to find themselves out of work with not nearly as much money as they had the year before. All of us have gone through recessions in our lifetimes, and we know what it's like to have to tighten the belt. So the store had a very faithful clientele with the men of 129 Field Artillery, Battery D. But oftentimes, according to the tradition, if somebody did come in and ask for Captain Truman, that they were there perhaps to buy a shirt or a collar or a tie. You can see the beautiful rows of ties hanging above Mr. Truman there in the left photograph, or a beautiful new hat, any type of men furnishings like that. But also, then when things started to get a little tight, they would come into Captain Harry, and Captain Harry, for the rest of his life, this relationship was reciprocal. And so for the rest of their lives, these men of Battery D and their captain, Captain Truman, they would always help each other, financially sometimes, with moral support, job references, things like that. There was a marvelous mutual loyalty. And those of you who have been in the military, you may have felt that same thing. Even those of us who are not military, who have a good working situation, we feel that loyalty. And the loving cup today, thankfully, survives and is part of the Truman Library's museum collection. So you can see this loving cup. And I can't help but think that gift to Captain Truman just meant the world to him. And that was a tangible way of showing their thanks. The intangible way of them showing their thanks was supporting Captain Truman, not only with his haberdashery, but with his subsequent career that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So yes, come 1921, things started to get a little tight. And what Mr. Truman and Mr. Jacobson started to realize was that as sales were decreasing, their margin between the sales and the expenses, that margin was starting to narrow. So they issued some limited stock. We know that Beth Wallace Truman's brother, Frank Wallace, was one of the investors. I wished we had some more examples of one of the stock certificates that went into the effort to shore up Truman and Jacobson. And perhaps as this program, as this video makes its way onto the internet, maybe somebody might discover one in their closets and such. And much like today, when we buy stocks and when we buy bonds, we are expressing some type of confidence in whatever we are investing in. And so in this case, Mrs. Charles Carroll felt very confident in Truman and Jacobson. But unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. And eventually, what at one time seemed like a marvelous profit margin at over $60,000 to $70,000, Mr. Truman and Mr. Jacobson started to find that they were going into the hole, and eventually the store had to close. Both of them were not very thrilled about the idea of declaring bankruptcy. Eddie Jacobson tried to avoid bankruptcy for a while, but he eventually couldn't. He did file under the bankruptcy laws at the time. Harry Truman chose not to. He chose to pay back those debts, and from the records that we have, it bears out that for the next 15 to 20 years, Harry Truman and his family lived a relatively modest life because they were still paying off the debts of the haberdashery. I really hope that nobody in our group today or nobody watching has had this type of business experience. I want success for everybody, but unfortunately, if you have, I'm sure you could understand what Mr. Truman and Mr. Jacobson were going through. And eventually, as some of these liens and loans and holds and such were sold off and transferred, eventually some were bought off. One, for example, was bought off by Harry Truman's brother, John Vivian, for a few cents on the dollar. So it took him a long time, but Truman did eventually retire the debt of Truman and Jacobson. Now, I wanted to show you something today that I did not know existed until just a few weeks ago. I was doing some research for a program that I'm going to be doing in a few weeks on Beth Truman's mother, Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace. And I was reviewing her personal papers at the Truman Library, which includes several years of financial records. And in one file from 1922, I saw a personal check written to Harry Truman and signed by his mother-in-law, Mrs. David W. Wallace. This is Madge Gates Wallace. And what really tickled me was how the check was endorsed on the back. And Harry Truman signed it. That's that famous signature that he used at the time. But down below the line is written Truman and Jacobson. Now, that leads me to wonder, did Mrs. Wallace perhaps make a $4.50 purchase, and that's how she paid, was to her son-in-law, who then endorsed the check over to Truman and Jacobson in 1922? Well, we'll never really know, I'm afraid, but this just really tickled me. Now, also living at home at the time at 219 North Delaware Street was Beth Wallace Truman's youngest brother, Fred. So maybe Mrs. Wallace bought something for her son, Fred. Again, we may never know, but this just really put a smile on my face when I saw it, and I thought you might like to see it. Harry Truman's mother helped the haberdashery, likely, even though it's only $4.50. But in business, every cent counts. Now, at the same time that the haberdashery was open for business in downtown Kansas City, Harry Truman elected to join the Army Reserve. One of the questions that I would love to jump back into a time machine and ask President Truman is, why did you do this? A lot of the indications that we have in letters that he wrote to his fiancée and to his cousins and to others was that he was so anxious to get home after serving in World War I that when he was discharged, that was going to be it for him and the United States Army. There are probably a couple different reasons for this. It might be that after reflecting a little bit, Captain Truman decided that he still felt an obligation to serve his country, and I truly believe that. I also believe that there's a possibility that Harry Truman might have seen a noble service in the United States Army Reserve Corps, not only patriotic, but as a way for perhaps some extra income. And maybe in the back of Truman's mind, too, he wondered if World War I was going to have some type of a sequel, and he wanted to somehow keep his ability sharp to be part of that if necessary. So there are quite a few reasons perhaps for this, but one of the reasons in hindsight, I'm sure Harry Truman is glad that he did this, was in 1953. When Harry Truman left the White House on January 20th of 1953, at that time, there was no pension for former presidents. There was no financial assistance for any office keep. He had no health insurance. He had no Secret Service protection. The only thing that Harry Truman had was an Army pension of just over $112 a month. And when calculating that number, that went all the way back to his days serving in the National Guard that we talked about last month, but it also included his service in World War I, and then also includes his service, as you see here, now that he was training in reserves as a major of field artillery. So this did have a long-term benefit for Truman in that it did contribute to that little bit of a pension that he received starting in 1953. Without that Army pension, once leaving the White House, Harry Truman for a couple of years would have had an income of pretty much zero. And then here comes the judge. So the haberdashery is going under. They could see the writing on the wall. And as you read, there's this marvelous narrative description of how Harry Truman's friends and colleagues in the Pendergast family approached him into running for county judge in eastern Jackson County. And if you're not from Missouri, if you're not from Jackson County, in Jackson County, eastern Jackson County meant everything outside of Kansas City proper. And my friends, if you're not from Missouri, in those days, the way the politics in Missouri worked was that counties at that time were managed by county judges. They weren't judges in the sense of the word that we commonly understand them, but more like county commissioners. And so some friends of Truman encouraged him to run for Eastern District Judge of Jackson County. And Truman did have the most wonderful resume, I think, that you could ask for. He was a native. He worked on a farm for many years. He was a veteran of the late war. He had a family, and he had just a stellar resume. Plus, one of the things that Harry Truman learned to do while living on the farm was engage in local politics a little. So he was involved in the local Democratic Party. He was a road overseer. He took over that when his father died. He was, for a brief time, postmaster of Grandview, Missouri. And he networked in the Masons and in the Baptist Church and in the Order of the Eastern Star and such. So that networking together with his resume, even though Truman did not have an education beyond high school, it made him a very attractive candidate. Mr. McCullough, I think, does a great job of describing the internal struggles between the goats and the rabbits, and the Truman family were very much on the goat side of the political spectrum. But here's a $1 million question. How do we reconcile a man like Tom Pendergast and his relationship with Harry Truman and vice versa? And I really believe that Truman scholars will be debating this for years and years and years to come. Even Tom Pendergast himself is a very difficult man to reconcile. And as you read, and there are so many wonderful books, I'd recommend one in particular called Tomstown about the Pendergast influence in Kansas City. There's no other way of saying it, was that there was a lot of corruption, machine politics. There was a great allegiance to the Pendergast machine. The Pendergast machine did do a lot of good for a lot of people. And as they said, politics is about friendship. But at the same time, you just can't deny that there were, in some cases, voter fraud. Vote early, vote often. Remember that line? Vote early and vote often. Plus some of the other activities that Mr. Pendergast and the organization were involved in. Yet this is a man who did attend daily mass together, was seemingly faithful to his wife. He's a very difficult man to reconcile. And I do spend a lot of sleepless nights sort of wondering, what is there in this relationship that maybe we don't know? And maybe someday we'll know the answer to that. The headquarters of Mr. Pendergast at 1908 Main Street is still in downtown Kansas City. You can go and see it. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a small, unassuming building. And I was able to step inside there one day. And what really hit me was that in this relatively humble building, American history changed, because in that building was given the green light for Harry Truman to run for this Eastern District Judge position, and then eventually when he ran for presiding judge, and then in this building for decisions that affected Truman as he went to run for the United States Senate. So if we say that Harry Truman in his way helped change the world during his presidency, this building then helped change the world because it helped shape Harry Truman's public service career. But I think it's very interesting when comparing the humble headquarters of the Pendergast in 1908 Maine, and then you see his home. And just out of curiosity, the other night, I went on Zillow, and the Pendergast home, which is also still standing in the country club area of Kansas City, it's now Zillowed an estimated value of $2.7 million. So, yeah, very, very difficult story to reconcile, and I understand that. I know that today, if you're like me, when you watch the news and you watch the cable news channels and all of that, and you ever notice that politics and campaigns never seem to end, and you see a lot of mud? Well, it flew back then too, when Truman was running for the first time for Eastern District Judge, and then when he was running for presiding judge. And it was something that Harry Truman had to endure. Really, all politicians and public servants, to an extent, have to endure. Now, to Harry Truman's credit, one thing he was able to do was he was able to separate that world of politics and personal friendships mostly. Now, there are a few exceptions. One famous one would be come 1952 with Eisenhower, but Truman was able to separate that. And he understood that politics was a rough and difficult game, and that he needed to play it. But at the same time, Truman was very reluctant to launch mutual attacks like this. So here you see that in a broadside that was posted by one of Truman's opponents, he was accused of not being accurate on his tax returns. Again, we still see the mud flying today, and I think it's reality. As long as there's politics, there'll probably be some mud. A lot of visitors who necessarily aren't from Missouri, they ask, well, how could Harry Truman have been a judge if he never went to college or never went to law school? And one of the questions I would love to ask Harry Truman is, why, sir, did you not complete your education at the Kansas City School of Law? And thankfully, his records for this survive. And Truman took a lot of the same classes that I would have loved to have taken. Early in my life, I had dreamed of becoming a lawyer. I wanted to be a public defender when I was a teenager. And when you look at some of these classes, they're not easy classes. Criminal law, contracts, which is one I think that would probably sink me, torts, damages. And one thing you can find on the Truman Library's website is you can find a lot of his exams and quizzes and such. And I really believe that if President Truman were to finish the Kansas City School of Law, he very well would have been, I think, a very good lawyer, but he didn't finish. And I often wonder if finances were one of the reasons. That's really why I really didn't go into law school, was because of the finances. So I wonder if that is the case, but it's a case of what might have been. I wanted to share this with you too. This is part of the National Park Service, the Truman Home collection. When Harry Truman, he served the one term as Eastern District Judge, then he lost for re-election, but then came back with a vengeance and won a position as presiding judge of Jackson County. In that position, he had this badge, and the badge is about the size of an Eisenhower dollar, if you can imagine one of those. And thankfully, when all of the objects at 219 North Delaware Street were cataloged, this was one of those items. And so we have on your behalf Harry Truman's presiding judge badge in part of our museum collection. And of course, that's business. That's the professional side. Mr. and Mrs. Truman wanted to have children. They both loved children. Not talked about a whole lot is that prior to the birth of Mary Margaret Truman in 1924, Mrs. Truman had had 2, possibly 3 miscarriages. And that was emotionally difficult. But in 1924, in the middle of a blinding snowstorm at home, Mrs. Bess Wallace Truman gave birth to their daughter, Mary Margaret. We can imagine that when Margaret was born, she cried. That might have been the first time that Margaret Truman sang, and wouldn't be the last time for sure. Now, while Mrs. Truman was in their bedroom giving birth, Judge Truman and his mother-in-law were sitting outside in the upstairs foyer, very nervous, as all first-time fathers are. I know I certainly was about 23 years ago. And then the happy event arrived. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Truman were so superstitious about the previous very sad miscarriages that they did not have any furniture specifically for Mary Margaret. And so for the first few days or maybe weeks of Mary Margaret's life, she slept in a dresser drawer. I really regret, late in life, Margaret shared that dresser that was probably hers was thrown out. I sort of wish that we still had that today. But when Margaret Truman was born in 1924, that did make 219 North Delaware a very full house for about 6 months. Mrs. Elizabeth Gates, whose husband built the house, she was still alive. Her daughter, Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace, Bess Truman's mother, Mrs. Truman, and then Harry Truman, and now Margaret, and then Mrs. Truman's youngest brother, Fred. So it was indeed a full house for about 6 months. And what a happy house I think it was. I have a treat for you. The film clip that I'm going to show, it's not very long, but I want to give a tip of the Ranger hat to my friend Lori Austin, who's an audiovisual archivist at the Truman Library, and to all of the archivists at the Truman Library. This film clip I would like to share with you is likely the earliest known piece of film of Harry Truman.
Officials of the National Daughters of the American Revolution are presenting today to Judge Harry S. Truman, President of the Old Trails Association, a pair of bookends, replicas of the famous Pioneer Mother statue. Lexington, Missouri was selected for the presentation because of its historical background. The replicas of the famous statue are exact in every detail. Mrs. John Trigg Moss of St. Louis, chairman of the National Old Trails Road Committee of the National Society of Daughters of the American Revolution, is taking a prominent part in the ceremony today. It's a striking tribute to those mothers who blazed the trail that is America.
Indeed, I love that film clip. And again, that's the earliest that we know of film clip with Harry Truman in it. And I look into his eyes, and I don't necessarily see a county politician accepting these on behalf of the people of Jackson County, which of course played a very important role. Independence is Queen City of the Trails. I wonder if he was thinking about his grandfather Solomon, who died back in 1892, who was one of those pioneers who took advantage of those trails for commerce, and then also thinking of his grandmother, Solomon Young's wife, who kept home on the farm during those times and then during the Civil War. So I think that gave Harry Truman a nice connection with his family as well. Harry Truman did write, after his presidency, a history of his administration. Those would be the 2-volume memoirs that we're going to talk about probably in the last session of this series. He never really did write what you would call a personal memoir, but several times over the years, he did sit down with pen and paper and scribble down some autobiographical things. But sometimes the stress of the job in Jackson County got to Truman so much that he got these headaches and fatigue. And sometimes he had to escape. He didn't go home to 219 North Delaware. Sometimes he checked into a hotel, and that's something he would continue to do even when senator and vice president and president of the United States. Sometimes he had to do that just to get away. This here is one of the most remarkable documents that survives from Harry Truman. And I put my email address on here. If we were going to be here for a few hours, I would love to read the whole thing to you. But in this particular document that Truman wrote at the Pickwick Hotel in the midst of his time as presiding judge of Jackson County, Truman is wrestling with himself. Now, yes, there were a lot of dishonest actors in the Pendergast machine and organization, but one thing Tom Pendergast did recognize was that Truman himself was honest, and that having an honest person in the machine was sometimes very good business as well. But Truman was getting very disgusted with some of the things that he was seeing in the way of contracts and wasteful money. And then once the Depression hits, he had to start laying people off, and the stress of that is always very difficult. But he's wrestling with the morality of this. And he's wondering, I am part of this machine. I am watching all of this corruption going on. And in some cases, I have to sign off on it. So in the Pickwick Hotel, he writes about this. It's one of the few times where he gives an insight into the family dynamic. You might remember from the book how Bess Wallace Truman's brother Fred was on the payroll as an architect for some of the building projects, the hospital, the Independence Courthouse, and such. And Truman makes reference to that in that he said, I had to put my drunken brother-in-law on the payroll just to keep peace in the family. That is a remarkable statement that he meant only for himself and his eyes. But I want to share with you what I think is the most remarkable part of the scribbling, and it's the last sentence. Am I an administrator or not? Or am I just a crook to compromise in order to get the job done? And then he says, you judge it, I can't. I would love to know who Truman means when he says, you judge it, I can't. I'm not sure that he ever intended for other people to see this, but maybe he is thinking about us here today on May, 5th, 2023. You judge it, I can't. This document is so incredible. I have my email address there on the screen. If any of you would like a copy of this document, I will happily email you a PDF copy of this. It is absolutely remarkable, and I read this thing honestly about once a week. It's just really remarkable. But now that Truman was term limited, come 1934, he has to decide what's next. Was he going to find another job with the county? He didn't finish law school, so he can't practice in a courtroom. Was he going to go back to selling automobile memberships like he did after he lost after the first term as Eastern District Judge? But then again, with the help of the Pendergast machine, he ran for the United States Senate. So you would have seen this particular vehicle making its way all around Missouri. And up to this point, Harry Truman really wasn't much of a name outside of Jackson County, except when people talked about some of the internal improvements, like the famous road system that the county built, or perhaps the courthouses and such. So now Truman was playing on a statewide stage and had to make the case that he was worthy to be a United States Senator. So here's a trivia question for you. Do you happen to know who has the official papers for Senator Truman's first term in the United States Senate? Some of you may think perhaps the Library of Congress, perhaps the Truman Library, perhaps another agency in the National Archives. Well, in case you didn't know, the answer is we don't know. Unfortunately, unfortunately, the location of Truman's official papers from his first term as United States Senator are not known to survive. I hope someday that statement will be proven wrong. And in my heart, I'm still convinced that they are somewhere in Washington, D.C. and might be a victim of mislabeling or something like that. Now, thankfully, with things like the congressional record and piecing together correspondence, now that we are in the digital age, new documents are often found, and that's wonderful. But I think one of the great Truman books that is yet to be written is of Truman's 10 years in the United States Senate. There's a new one coming out next week that focuses on the so-called Truman Committee that we'll be talking about next month. It's a pretty good book. And a friend of mine is working on a new book on Truman as senator that I'm really anxious for. But it is challenging when discussing this first term in that there's a lot of primary material that we just don't have. And so Harry Truman made this campaign. By this time, in 1934, Harry Truman was improving as an orator, although he would never necessarily be the the great spectacular orator like we would say of Daniel Webster or Abraham Lincoln, or in recent times, Barack Obama. Truman, he always had a very stiff, a very clipped way of talking, but he also had a very concise way of talking too, which I'm sure Beth is wishing that I had during this program. But he had a marvelous way of communicating with people. And as he made his way around Missouri, he was able to connect with other farmers. He was able to connect with other veterans. So that, together with the Pendergast help and such, he was able to do this. Now, next year, we're going to be heading into another period where a third of the United States Senate is going to be up for grabs. Can you imagine a United States Senate campaign run in the general election for just about $1,000? There were times in Truman's senatorial campaigns where he didn't have enough money to stay in a hotel, so he slept in his car. That sounds so quaint and so romantic. Truman probably would disagree if he were here, but it was a different world, wasn't it? And also by this time, Truman himself, he was not a very wealthy man. Now, when you look at a modern electoral map of Missouri, it's changed a little bit, but here you see, I wanted to show you the 1934 election. So you do see a lot of blue, and you do see some red, but you do see a lot of blue. Of course, Jackson County, heavily blue. And again, Truman, with the help of the Pendergast machine, he was able to make that connection with farmers. He was able to make that connection with veterans. This is also in the Depression, and so Truman was a true out-and-out New Dealer, even though he didn't have necessarily the best relationship with FDR. So we are still very much a New Deal country as well, and Truman was able to benefit from that. But Truman himself was still not very financially well off. Now, today, I believe a United States senator makes about, I think it's $175,000 a year, thereabouts. Well, I wanted to show you, I just picked one year for you of Harry Truman's 1940 tax return, for example. And his salary went anywhere from $8,000 to $10,000 a year. Now, when you turn that into today's dollars, again, according to the Department of Commerce, it's just over $200,000. So it's sort of on par with what today's United States senators make. And like many United States senators, Harry Truman is trying to juggle having multiple homes. He is the primary breadwinner for 219 North Delaware Street, supporting a wife and a daughter and his mother-in-law. And at the same time, you'll see that on his tax return, he was also the primary caregiver for his aging mother, who by this time was quite aged. So Harry Truman and Bess Truman did find their dollar stretched quite a bit. So that added to the stress as well. But if Harry Truman were here, I think that he would tell you that even though there was stress with this and the job was a stressful one, he put everything he had into that job. Truman loved the Senate and would have been perfectly content to have gone on serving in the United States Senate. But when you remember reading in McCullough how they changed apartments frequently, well, that's why, because the money was very, very tight. So as we transition into the year 1940, Harry Truman had one term in the United States Senate under his belt. He was going to run for re-election, but he also still had that albatross of the Pendergast machine, the network around his neck. Plus, in addition to that, even though we were still sort of a New Deal country, there were some who were becoming disillusioned with the New Deal. So many were starting to fade away from Roosevelt and moving towards the Republican camp. So for Harry Truman, it was not a guaranteed reelection in 1940. He was going to have to work harder for that than for almost anything else that he was going to do in his life. But I would propose to you that it was in this second term as United States Senator that Harry Truman's public service career really started to hit the heights on that. And it's in this second term that Harry Truman and his, what they called the so-called Truman Committee, really started to gain fame, saving taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. And then shortly after re-election, Pearl Harbor was attacked. We are now a nation at war again. And as United States Senator, Harry Truman and his abilities as United States Senator would really play an important role. And then his role and work and legacy as United States Senator helped him acquire a different position a few years later. So I hope that you will consider joining us next month. I'm sorry, I have the wrong date on there. Another typo. I'm so sorry. It's Thursday, June 8th, 2023 at 2 p.m. I'm sorry about the typos today. I hope that you will join us for this, as always, on the first Thursday of every month. And if any of these items that you saw in the slide deck today, the photographs or the documents, if you would like to see any of them or see them up close, please send me an email and I can send you the picture or the documents, usually in a PDF format. They now belong to you. And so I always remind people, your government is your government. And so if any of these would be beneficial to you, I would be more than happy to send them your way. And most of the images are from our collection and also from the Truman Library, the National Archives collection. So Beth, how are we doing? Any questions or anybody have anything they want to talk about?
Yeah, brilliant. Does anyone have questions? You're welcome to jump. And it is June 1st. Our
June
next
1st,
meeting
I'm
will
sorry.
be Thursday, June 1st at 2 p.m.
June 1st, sorry about that. May 8th is Harry Truman's birthday next week. So I think that's where my brain was. Sorry
Happy
about
birthday.
that. Happy birthday, Mr. Truman.
Yeah. So we'll hang around here for just a little bit if anyone has questions or
Gosh, it just
conversation.
seems so weird that we're in May going into June. It just seemed like New Year's, doesn't it?
I'm not really in this year still, I feel like.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to talk about?
Great. And if you're jumping off, thank you so much. So appreciate you all. I'll send out the video link next week as soon as it's live on our YouTube channel.
Yes, indeed. Today is National Day of Prayer, which was one of those proclamations signed by Harry Truman. So yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you for reminding us of that. This month is also the 75th anniversary of the establishment of Israel. And so another example of something that changed the world. Truman was the first world leader to recognize Israel.
Brilliant. Thank you all for coming. It's such a joy to have you. And as always, Doug, you are a wealth of knowledge and we so value all of your wisdom.
Well, I love this. I'm just grateful for all of you for being here today. We hope to see you next month.